Welcome to page 85 of Anatomy Coloring Book. This is Dr. Harkins. We're going to learn about spinal reflexes. Well, traditionally, you know what a reflex is when you go to the doctor's office, and he takes this hammer right here, and he or she taps your knee with it. And this lesson is essentially what happens, why does your knee, and of course he taps the tendon, the patellar tendon right there, and your knee kicks, your leg kicks forward. Why does that happen? So that's our topic. Let's start with a general overview here. So the doctor taps what's called the patellar tendon right here. And there are receptors in the tendon that sense the stretch. So when the hammer hits the tendon looks like this, and the hammer hits it, right? It's a triangular shaped hammer. When that happens, the tendon bends inward like this, causing a stretch of the patellar tendon. And these signals, that sends a signal. There are receptors called stretch receptors or muscle spindles, and receptors in the tendon that very rapidly head towards the spinal cord, the dorsal to the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. Then what happens in response to that is, so the message gets sent up to the brain, right? Actually, in this case, the message doesn't get sent to the brain. This is a spinal cord reaction that happens only in the spinal cord. The message doesn't even need to go to the brain. You don't even need to be aware of it. And from the anterior horn, the motor horn of the spinal cord, comes a message to the muscle, telling it to contract. And when the muscle contracts, these quadricep muscles, you know that from our discussion on muscles, that the muscles come together, that the muscle shortens. So when it shortens, it pulls this tendon up in this direction, causing the leg to kick outward. So the nerve that came out of the anterior horn is a motor nerve. And as we discussed before, it's also called an efferent nerve because it's coming this away from the spinal cord. The other nerve, the other neuron going toward the spinal cord, is a sensory nerve, also known as an afferent nerve. Why? Because it's going toward the spinal cord. So there are stretch receptors in the tendon here, and there are stretch receptors also in the muscle itself, called muscle spindles. Again, this is a sensory neuron here, sending message to the spinal cord. And then a motor neuron carries the message to the muscle, to the neuromuscular end plate, which is known as the effector muscle. The effector muscle from an efferent nerve. An efferent nerve takes a message to the effector muscle telling it to contract. Now let's take a closer look at it. So this is basically the same scenario down here, except a more magnified look. So here is the muscle spindle, an example of the muscle spindle. It's a receptor inside the muscle. And here's an example of a receptor inside the tendon. This is this receptor here. And this is the receptor that's inside the muscle, called the muscle spindle. When the doctor taps on the knee, it stretches the muscle spindle and here, as well as the receptor in the tendon. When these stretch, they get fired up, they get excited, and they send a signal down the nerve, or the neuron, into the spinal nerve, and out through to the dorsal root ganglion, it's called, where the cell bodies lie. It fires through here really, really fast, through the posterior horn of the spinal cord, the sensory area, and then synapses here at the anterior horn with and here's the cell body of a motor neuron or an efferent neuron, and sends the message outward through the spinal nerve and out to the muscle, to the motor end plates, the neuromuscular junction, telling that muscle to contract or shorten. And that's where we get the kick. One thing I neglected to tell you, after this signal comes in through the spinal nerve and then exits, I just wanted to remind you that this is the posterior root. Then after the synapse, the signal travels on this motor nerve here through the anterior root. Also known as the ventral root. Ventral means the front. And of course, this is known as the dorsal as well. The dorsal root. Talking about this structure right here. I'm talking about this structure here. So in summary, the spinal nerve, of course, is this structure here, spinal nerve, where both go through, both anterior or both afferent and efferent nerves travel through the spinal nerve. But only efferent or afferent nerves, sensory nerve, travel through, or neurons travel through the dorsal root. Of course, this is called the dorsal root ganglion, right here, this little bump where all these cell bodies lie. And then, of course, the anterior root, here, the ventral root. Now let's move on to a slightly more complicated reflex called the polysynaptic reflex. Poly means many, anytime you see the word poly. And let's, it's a reflex, sort of a pain reflex here. So let's say this person puts their hand on a flame. Of course, a pain receptor here is going to be excited, and it's going to send a signal. We're going to use blue. We've been using blue for afferent nerves. It sends a signal up here in this direction, this direction to the spinal cord. And let's take a closer look at what happens. Well, let's talk about it right now. And then the signal comes back from the spinal cord through an efferent motor nerve to the motor end plates of the muscle, the neuromuscular junction, and says, yikes, contract, shorten, pull away, telling this muscle to contract, to pull away. Well, what's interesting about this polysynaptic reflex is that at the same time, the muscle tells the nerve tells the muscle to loosen up and not contract. So on one side, the side that contracts to move the hand away, it says contract. On the other side, we don't want this muscle to tighten up, because if this muscle contracts, then it'll go to the flame, into the flame, if this muscle contracts. So there's an inhibitory nerve, motor nerve, that comes down and says, loosen up and allow this muscle over here, this agonist muscle, to contract. So it's a send a signal to contract over here and relax over here. Allow it to stretch so that your hand can move up and away. We'll talk more in detail about that right now. Let's go back. Here's the detail. Here we have the pain from the flame right here. That's an awful flame. That's not so bad. A candle, okay? And it's reading these signals and it's saying, ouch, pain. There's a pain receptor that says ouch. Travels through this afferent nerve, this sensory nerve or pain fibers, into the spinal nerve, SN. And then out of the spinal nerve into the dorsal root, through the dorsal root ganglion, and into the posterior horn or the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. Here is where a polysynaptic reflex occurs. Here's where the word poly comes in, because it means many synapses. And so at the dorsal root here, we'll make these interneurons, the neurons in between, we'll make them this lighter blue. There's a synapse with an interneuron right here, and right here. And another synapse. Look, many synapses, polysynaptic. Another right here goes synapses with two separate anterior or two separate efferent motor nerves. Look at this. Not one, as in this case, but two. Polysynaptic reflex. And these messages, these electrical signals, start traveling away from the spinal cord, efferent motor, away through the spinal nerve and out the spinal nerve to the muscle. One of them, one signal, tells the muscle to contract, and another signal tells this muscle to relax. Here's a positive contraction, sort of a negative contraction, you could say. So these neurons, one of these neurons, this one right here, this neuron right here is known as, because it tells the muscle to contract, it's called a facilitatory neuron. It facilitates or makes contraction easy. Facilitate means to make easy. And this other neuron over here, right, that heads down this way, tells the muscle to relax. And that's inhibitory. It's inhibiting contraction, not facilitating contraction. So that's interesting. So this neuron right here must have been an inhibitory or a facilitatory neuron, positive contraction. And this second neuron must have been an inhibitory interneuron. These are the interneurons in between the afferent nerve and the efferent nerve, are interneurons that either facilitate or inhibit muscle contraction. And of course, this muscle here, which is inhibited, is an effector, or of course, and this is known as an effector neuron, and a motor neuron, an inhibitory effector motor neuron, and this is a facilitatory effector motor neuron. And that concludes our lesson on spinal reflexes on page 85 of Anatomy Coloring Book. I'm Dr. Stephen Harkins. Until the next lesson.